Hello, and thank you for joining us. Today I have Mihaela. She is a student at the Freudian School of Quebec, and she's a clinician who practices psychoanalytically. Mihaela, thanks for joining us today.
I think it's funny to hear you introduce me as a student, but I guess we are all students of psychoanalysis to one degree or another, or students of our own unconscious, if you will.
Ah,
Um,
yes, yes,
but thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
yes. Good. Um, yeah, I found you because I was talking with Dr. Donald Carveth, and we were talking about kind of Freud and Christianity and ideas surrounding that. And he mentioned something along the lines of Freud had contempt for Christianity, and Freud mocked the Christian love command. And so I that in some ways it wouldn't surprise me. In some ways, I was like, I don't know, I can't recall for certain. So I kind of started looking into some of those writings, but I wanted to get some help, and so I found you, and so
Uh-huh.
I emailed you, sent you some questions, and so here we are. So
Uh-huh. And how did you find me exactly?
I was, I think I Googled, Freudian psychoanalysts or Freudian School of Psychoanalysis or something, and then
Mhm.
I found a link to a blog that you wrote, I believe, and you wrote
Mhm.
a blog on love and hate, I think it was.
Uh,
And so I started thinking, this is my person.
I see, yes. That was my practical psychoanalysis blog that I used to write for PsychCentral.com before it got purchased by, there was a different person who was the editor at the time, and then it got purchased. And so I believe this article now maybe made one of the few that remained, which actually I only wrote the introduction to that article. That
Oh,
was written by the American Psychoanalytic Association. They had contacted me and requested to do a guest post. Uh,
oh,
But you had some interesting questions about love, and how to think about love, which it got me thinking. Um, and I went back to reading a little bit of what Freud wrote about it and kind of reformulating some of his thoughts through my experience with the Freudian School of Quebec and learning from the psychoanalysts there, Willie Apollon, Danielle Bergeron, and Lucy Cantin, and kind of also basing all of my experience with clients. I work with couples, I work with families, and I work with young adults who kind of struggle in their relationships. So this
hmm.
question of love is actually it's quite fundamental. Um, so I could say more about that, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, some kind of general questions that I had, and maybe you can just kind of speak to this is,
Mhm.
yeah, I was curious about what were Freud's views on love? Did he believe it was possible to be altruistic? Um, would Freud say that it was possible to love our neighbors as ourselves, or that that was a good thing or a bad thing?
Mhm.
One in particular, uh, does loving everyone as we love ourselves deflate its value? But those are some kind of questions I came up with, and I was
Right.
hoping maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, those are very interesting questions. I think you can, and from our conversation earlier, it sounds like you are kind of exploring different aspects of psychoanalytic writing and its application.
Hmm.
But the question of love, I think, and the way that Freud wrote about it, so there's several essays on the psychology of love that he wrote. The one that originally had come up to my mind when I read your questions were the one on transference love, which he wrote about in the techniques of psychoanalysis. They're mostly written for clinicians who want to work with psychoanalytic patients. And in that essay, he explores the love that the patient may have towards their analyst or their doctor. and he interprets that through transference. That was one of his essays on transference, and it's an obstacle to the work of psychoanalysis, this falling in love. Um, and this we use nowadays in the clinical mental health field and in psychology. Everybody speaks about transference, right? But at the time, I think it was quite revolutionary, kind of these ideas that he was trying to explore. And the other essay that he writes on object choice is his essay on narcissism. I'm not sure if you've read any of those. And then he has two other ones in which he talks about uh, the I have them right here actually. A special type of choice of object made by men is the one, and then the other one is on the universal tendency to debasement in the sphere of love. Have you read those essays at all? Do you know about
No,
them?
no.
So those are some of the major ones. But what occurred to me while going back to them and rereading some of them was that Freud was primarily writing, on the one hand, he was mostly writing about neurotic patients, I think. And on the other hand, he was also primarily writing in the sphere of what I would call, like, what Lacan calls the imaginary register. Um, so I don't know if you know anything about Lacan, Jacques Lacan, but he was
It's really complex.
right. So he was a psychoanalyst in France, and the school of Freudian, the Freudian school of Quebec is a little bit kind of, in my mind, kind of post-Lacanian. So
Wow.
we think of a lot of his concepts, but also kind of taking them a step further. Um, are you with me?
Yeah.
Sorry, you froze there for a second. Taking them a step further to and applying them to kind of what we're faced with today. Um, with mondialisation is a concept by Willie Apollon of the confrontation of civilizations today in different cultures and what that means. So the love that I think Freud was writing about, in my mind, is what I would term here like imaginary love. And I think so that's borrowing the term of the imaginary register of Lacan and also the imaginary transference that Willie Apollon talks about. Um, so this is just a different way of looking at transference. And would this, I don't know if this, how does this strike you is what I'm saying. I have a whole explanation about what I mean by this.
Yeah, go ahead and go into that because I'm not I'm not exactly familiar with the imaginary. Uh,
Transference.
yeah.
Well, Willie makes a distinction between the imaginary transference and the symbolic transference. But when I think about love, I'm thinking that we fall in love with the image of that the other has for us, or the image that we project onto the other, or that the other in the social link or in the world that we live in. Um, so that image is more closely related to our egos. And when you read
Mm.
Freud, he talks quite a lot about the ego, the object choice, the pleasure principle, sexual instincts, right? Um, so the ego is different from what Lacan, I think, talked about and what we talk about at the Freudian School of Quebec, which is the subject of the unconscious or desire. So Lacan introduces the concept of desire there, and that tends to complicate things. But the image that we have, or the ego, is one aspect of a human and is different from the intimate experience that each one of us has that nobody else has access to. Um, and so personally, I think I've been kind of preoccupied with this question of love, I think, for quite a while. Your question made me think through just the phases of that in my personal experience. And a lot of the love, I think, that a neurotic would experience, I think, is very much in the field of this imaginary love in relation to the other person. Um, and another thing that we might say, or that Willie might say, is that love is usually a symptom. It's a symptom of the neurotic. Our
Huh.
entire love life may be considered as such, mostly because when we're little, we create these blueprints based on the relationships that we have with our primary caregivers about what it means to be loved, what's expected of us in order to be loved and approved. And then the neurotic typically creates a whole solution to how to be in the world based off of what goes on in that intimate experience, what Freud might call the id, right? The unconscious, the out of language, and then the expectations and the rules and the norms in the world that the ego is going to create some kind of compromised version of itself to be able to exist in both of these spheres, the sphere of the unconscious and the world outside of the body. Um, and so this blueprint that we follow tends to, I think, serve as a foundation for our relationships moving forward, right? And it gets with every next stage of development, um, puberty, adolescence, young adulthood, we kind of tend to build on that blueprint. And what what Willie and the analysts of DFQ have created was the concept of the fantasy of seduction. So this blueprint creates a structure within which we function and patterns that repeat in a person's life that are based on this fantasy of seduction. We behave a certain way in order to be loved or receive love, which we're all human beings. We're all in relation to others. We need others. It's fundamental that we have others in our lives. So you can see how deeply rooted this is. But it's certainly a deviation from what Freud talked about. This will be different, I think, for the perverse subject, for the psychotic subject. So you mentioned earlier when we chatted before this that you've been interested in psychosis also, and um, for the psychotic, I think love will be very different. It's not going to be the same kind of relational object, relational experience. The psychotic often is interested in things other than themselves, but the delusion tends to serve as an obstacle to that concern, to that love for something outside of themselves. For the neurotic person, the fantasy of seduction is an obstacle. So our symptom, being in love with another person, is often an obstacle to kind of looking internally at our own desire and bringing that to life, which is what Freud kind of touched on in his essay on transference love. I think in there he says when the patient is in love with the clinician, it's an obstacle to the patient actually looking internally at what's going on for them. And often, when people enter analysis, if they fall in love even with somebody else outside of the analysis, they become so preoccupied with this other person that it's hard for them to actually look internally. So
Hmm.
that's something that one needs to work through in order to get to a much deeper subjective experience. Um,
When you
Go ahead.
say, yeah, no, that's fun. Thank you. So when you say a symptom,
Mhm,
for example, I just read this book, A Shadow of the Figure of Light by this Jungian, and he
mhm,
was arguing that um, for the alcoholic or the one addicted to substances, that they have a spiritual problem and that well, Jungians would say we all have spiritual problems, but so they
mhm,
have, and so when they intake alcohol, alcohol is like a spirit, and yeah, it's a symptom. But if you understand the symptom and what it's trying to tell you about maybe what's out of line or out of kilter, then you know something more about yourself. And is it
mhm,
somewhat similar to say that love is a symptom, or like in terms of the transference, at first Freud thought of it as something blocking the progress of the work, but then he
mhm,
came to look at it as actually this is something that we can use in
mhm,
in order to better understand where this is coming from and what it says about the person, and then we can point it back to them. Is that
Hmm.
similar?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, those are two separate issues, but maybe they're connected too, just in terms of alcohol, because one of the arguments is that, alcohol is primarily concentrated on the oral, um, as a
Oh.
partial object of the body, and it satisfies certain needs for people that relate to very primitive, primordial relationship with a primary caregiver and the breast.
Hmm.
And so you can talk about all kinds of things in terms of nurturing and connection and yeah, trauma, if you will. So that's in and of itself a whole thing. But I think you're right. Transference, if one, well, there's different positions that different psychoanalysts will work with that. If you're an object relational psychoanalyst, you might use this transference love and interpret it and work in that. The psychoanalysis that I'm talking about, and that I write about in the Practical Psychoanalysis blog, and the one that I'm practicing, is outside of that. So the analyst needs to remain outside of these object relational dynamics because they mostly serve as an obstacle to the subject in achieving or
Oh.
getting access to their desire. So there wouldn't be any interpretation of this for the patient. They may be encouraged to speak about it, or there may not be any comment on that if they mention it. So it
Wow.
depends on who is speaking and how, yeah, what the patient's history is, because it's hard to generalize these things, because they're obviously very subjectively motivated, and it will be
Hmm.
different for a different subject.
Hmm. I don't think I've ever heard of a psychoanalyst not like using or interpreting the transference.
Yeah, so that goes back to what I said at the beginning, the concept of Willie Apollon. This is what he called the imaginary transference,
Huh.
as far as I understand it.
Oh.
And that's something that we are aware of it as a clinician or analyst. One can be aware of what's going on because they know the history of the person, but we don't interfere or we don't intervene at that level. Um,
Hmm.
we try to stay outside of it because if we did, then we become yet another other who is part of the fantasy of seduction for the patient.
Huh.
And this is, again, speaking of neurotic people, they will be slightly different if we're talking about a perverse person, like a perverse structure according to Lacan's formulation, and a psychotic.
Hmm.
There you have a scenario, and with the psychotic, you have a delusional enterprise, and those are different ways of situating the work, I think.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. I would like to delve further into that topic alone at some point. Thanks
Yeah.
for bringing that to my attention. Willie Apollon. Okay.
Yes, Willie Apollon
Um,
has a lot of, yeah, they've written a lot. Him, Danielle Bergeron, and Lucy Cantan.
okay.
And I can send you
Do
their
you-
names afterwards and actually point you to another podcast
yeah.
that is very interesting, that you may find some inspiration from. That's
Okay,
done
yeah.
by one of the members of the EFQ. Her name is Fernanda Negrete, and the
Uh,
podcast is called Penumbra Cast. Um,
okay.
so there she has an interview actually with Willie Apollon. Uh,
Oh,
so I think you may like that. Yeah.
okay, cool. Thank you. Um, this came to my mind. So you were talking about love being a symptom and how it's kind of a reflection of our own ego. So, like
Hmm.
the typical example, would that be something similar to, there's let's say that I'm not a very creative person, but there's this person that's very creative, and I fall in love with them. Um, I would, in some forms of thought, you might say that, well, that's an indication that you long to be more creative and that you you see it out there, you value it, maybe you don't have that developed, but you see it out there and you fall in love with that person who, symbolizes that, and then hopefully you don't just stop there, but you grow closer to them in the way that they are and they help you develop your creativity or your personality. Is that somewhat kind of similar to what you're talking to?
As a symptom, yeah.
Mhm.
But
Okay.
this is what Freud talked about, actually.
Oh.
He talked about this, and that's in his essay on narcissism. Um, he talks about two types of love.
Oh.
One is according to the narcissistic type, and I'm quoting here from page 555 and um, in the Freudian Reader, edited by Peter Gay here. So, according to the narcissistic type, it's you fall in love with what a person himself is,
Mhm.
what he himself was, what he himself would like to be, or someone who was once part of himself. So that's part of his narcissistic type of love, right?
Okay.
Uh, and then he calls the other one an eclectic attachment type. So
Oh.
you fall in love with the woman who the person falls in love, and he talks about, he uses he here, right?
Mm.
The woman who feeds him or the man who protects him. So that was his first kind of definition.
Mm.
So that's all part of, I think, yeah, this ego psychology that
Okay.
he began there.
Do you agree with the kind of colloquial, you hear everyone say it nowadays, like, how am I supposed to love someone else if I can't love myself?
Hmm. Well, I actually, to a certain degree, I do agree, but people fall in love all the time with others who perhaps love them more than they can love themselves, and that's part
Mm.
of the whole system that keeps them together, right? You just
Yeah.
found somebody that you can see yourself in their eyes or something, that they can, you can see yourself in the reflection of their eyes or how they see you, what they imagine. That's all part of this kind of imaginary love that I mentioned, that I feel like Freud talked about, and what's the symptom. Um, but I think there's a different love that I wanted to speak about that goes a step further from that, which will be, in a way, you can say, once you have found the love for yourself, but not just for the self that you present to other people, not the love for your ego, but the love for your own desire or your own spirit, your own creative spirit. Um, and then you can connect with other people on this kind of more, uh, I guess we could say spiritual level, but it doesn't have anything to do with religion.
Yeah.
But if it's a connection with another creative spirit than the other, right? Willie Apple has this concept of the spirit that he's developed for a while, that it kind of has something to do with, and he also uses the word quest for the person's desire. So once you've been able to find love for that within oneself, that also connects to other concepts like the concept of the feminine and the creative energy that we all have. I think then it allows a different, and once you've worked through your own fantasy of seduction for your own self, and traverse that, then I think that opens up a space for a different kind of love for other people. Um, One that connects to something beyond just our own selves. Um,
Mm.
and I have a couple of examples of that. For instance, um, publicly, I'm going to declare my love for President Zelensky, for instance. And
Mm.
that is me connecting with the spirit in him and what he brings to humanity. When I listen to an interview, for example, that he's giving, he gave one to 60 Minutes that was, I think, broadcasted last week or the week before. And we see this man who's in a body, but who is embodying the spirit in him that's fighting for something that's beyond his personal self. And that kind of love that I can have for him, it brings me to tears listening to his interview. And that kind of love has nothing to do with what kind of a man he is in the bedroom with his wife.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? The way that his wife would love him has nothing to do with how he can be loved by people for whom he is standing up for.
Mhm.
It's a similar feeling of love that I can have for somebody who I'm listening to um, on my couch, for instance, or a child that I'm working with who's really struggling, but there's something in them that they have to contribute. There's a creative spirit in them that I can listen to and listen for and try to support. Um, but the probably the biggest or the strongest way that I felt that kind of love will be for instance, for my children. I have two of them, but it's not the type of narcissistic love that Freud talked about, where a child is experienced as an extension of the self, and a fulfillment of all the wishes that a parent wanted for themselves but couldn't have, but more as two separate human beings who have something they could contribute to the world that may be different from, what I want for them, and yet supporting them in becoming who they need to become. So this kind of love Willie talks about is part of the register of the sublime. As I would call it, real love that connects to the register of the real too. For me,
Mhm.
there's something out of language, really, and it's a feeling that I have that I am willing to kind of give my own life to make it to continue this other thing. The same way that I think Zelensky is willing to give his own life to fight for what he called spravedlivость, which is justice.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I'm not sure how you're hearing that, but
Yeah.
it's different from the neurochemical, physiological love and the release of hormones in the brain and the attachment one will have to a person based off of skin to skin contact, right? This is a different kind of
Mhm.
love I'm talking about.
Yeah, and you bring up a lot of good points because when it comes to something like love, there is, I think it's an endless, a bottomless, pit of there. We can never get to the bottom of. We have to go through all these different definitions and types of love. And I'm glad that you brought up the example of the love that you have for your kids. That's something I was thinking of earlier as well. Um, I think that what you say makes a lot of sense, and I'm trying to think that towards, so maybe the sublime love, then. Let's say kind of that, and maybe this doesn't have to be tied to a religion, but kind of that you've heard of people experiencing this on something like MDMA or some type of a
Mm-hmm.
psychoactive drug. So the type
Mm-hmm.
of where you just feel like you're one with the universe and you realize that others are also one with the universe and that you're all interconnected. You all come from the same source. You are all one. Um,
Mm-hmm.
just popped up in different in different segments, basically. And then that kind of the Christian love command of loving your neighbor as yourself, or kind of that more altruistic love, is that would that kind of fall under the sublime love? Is that possible, realistic?
It's a very tall order, I think. I think in one of your questions, there was also a question of, is this like a developmental
Oh
stage or
yeah.
something? And I do believe that there is a certain developmental aspect to it because um, when we're younger children, it makes perfect sense to be entirely self-focused for quite a while because we still live in a world where, and our brains are still developing. Up to age about 12 or so, we kind of live very much in this egocentric kind of space. Once abstract thought comes into play and people are able to hold separate ideas, two conflicting ideas being true at the same time, whilst once they have a certain moral development, I think you were asking about moral development there, then you're able to see that two separate truths can be contradicting and true at the same time. You can love multiple people at the same time. You can have conflicting feelings. I do believe that there's a certain stage of or phase of development. And in, the way I think about it is in the process of analysis, it is somewhat of a developmental trajectory to reach a place in your analysis where you're no longer concerned about your own ego or your own self, but you're concerned about something outside of yourself, outside of your own ego, something that's going to surpass you, that goes beyond the time that you have on this earth, that could potentially remain after your time on this earth, but that also concerns other people. So, and that has to do with, I think I have that feeling sometimes when I read certain writers who are no longer with us, right? And the same way you can read Freud, who's no longer with us, but his spirit is alive in his writing. So yeah, I think um, to loving another person as you love yourself, I would add loving another person more than you love yourself is actually
Hmm.
where one can get to, and but loving that which they can contribute to humanity as such. Regarding the drug use and getting in these psychedelic states, I there's perhaps something of people's unconscious that they're able to access while they're on drugs that stays with them, but I honestly don't feel like one needs to do that in order to access that part about oneself.
Hmm.
Um, One can do that in analysis and have that feeling perfectly sober towards other people.
Yeah, you're like, I'm just advocating here. Yeah, because at first, when you brought that up, I was thinking, yeah, meditation too, that's something that really brings it about. But I don't think I had thought about psychoanalysis bringing about that kind of deep experiential feeling of love for other people and humanity. That's cool.
Yeah, I think that's in humanity in its form and in its present, but in it also in its future, right? Because um, we live in a certain culture, we live in certain civilizations, and those things tend to pass us. But as humans, we remain, right? And we remain in thanks to living on an earth that we need to preserve, and one day perhaps we'll have to surpass if we're to survive. So having that love for what humanity has to bring, I think, is important. And yeah, it's one of the goals, I think, of psychoanalysis, if you will, being able
Mm.
to get to that place as a subject, as a human, and then sharing that with others. Which is why when we first started, I told you there's a very specific definition of what a psychoanalyst is at the Freudian School of Quebec. And it's impossible for one to accompany another person to this place that I'm talking about without having gone through it themselves. Because if you are stuck in these other egocentric or ego to ego or object relations kind of dynamics, you're still you're not outside of that the seduction piece for the neurotic, for instance, and you can't really operate outside of it, right?
Mm.
Um, and most of the psychoanalysts, I think, in the United States, at least the way I read their writing and the way I hear them, and I've been involved in this field for quite a while now, I think a lot of them function still in that parameter of within the fantasy of seduction. And they operate within that place of transference love that Freud wrote about, and they operate within the imaginary transference. To get to something outside of that, it requires a very specific work that each one of us has to do that allows us to then be accompany another. And so the EFQ has the process of the past conclusive, in which you testify to your own experience and analysis, and in that, then your love for this something else, or at least it gets elaborated. And I don't think other people talk about it as love. Uh, this is what your questions kind of made me think of. So,
Uh, uh,
but Tracy McNulty has a very interesting interview with Fernanda in that podcast I mentioned to you,
mm,
Penumbra. I believe it's actually the very first episode. And she elaborates a lot more specifically about what a psychoanalyst means, and what's the past conclusive there.
okay. I feel like I have a whole new world to explore.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear that. Yeah, I'm so
Um,
glad to hear that.
I want to be respectful of your time. I did want to allow you a few minutes to speak to your experience in your practice. And from my understanding, you work with children and adolescents. And yeah, can you tell us a little bit about that and how you incorporate psychoanalysis into your work with children and adolescents too?
Yeah. Well, it's a very good question, and probably it's an ongoing question because the psychoanalysis that I just described is it's not exactly possible with somebody who's still in the process of becoming a human, right?
Yeah.
But I certainly incorporate. I mean, that's how I've been trained for so many years, and how I think about things. I certainly incorporate the meta psychology all the time, um, and I try to create a space in my practice for young people for what is outside of their social context, their familial context. And
Mm,
that also means making space for their parents and what in them has remained unresolved that may be causing problems unconsciously, if you will, on their relationships. And to relate it back to love, I think what ends up happening a lot in families is that people don't realize that what they may be doing in the family may be making their children feel like they're not loved.
mm,
And that has long term effects for generations, actually. And so part of my work is to try to help people understand how what they say and what they do is affecting their children. And I also try to kind of empower the kids to have a space of their own to process through these things so that they're not traumatic one day, right? So they're not traumatic. Um, but so that's one aspect of it, I guess, that relates to love. I also work with a lot of people who've been through trauma, so young adults who've experienced trauma. And to me, because psychoanalysis can take a long time sometimes,
mm.
the reason why I work with young people is because the sooner you start trying to look at yourself and addressing some of those issues, the better. Um, so I try to make that space for people. And sometimes the work is, it's a long-term kind of work, but I find it very rewarding when young people can really take ownership of their life from an early age and make something of themselves, and bring in their desire to life. So,
Yeah, that's got to be awesome to maybe start working with someone at 14 or 15 years old, and then maybe now they're 18 or 19 and they've just developed this sense of understanding themselves, kind of understanding their family history and why we do what we do, and how much influence do I have directly over these decisions and actions and behaviors, and what does that say about me, what does it say about my family.
mhm.
That's just a very different mindset to be in. I wish I had given more pause as a teenager.
It's hard. I mean, it's very hard, I think, as a teenager because you're still, trying
Mm.
to figure, and especially as an adolescent, it's something that one needs to kind of confront, I think, to a certain degree on your own. And in fact, I will tell you, it is very difficult to engage an adolescent in this kind of work because they kind of are like, I'm on my own, folks. I'm gonna
Yeah.
fear that I'm gonna figure this out. Um, but it's an ongoing question, I think, how to apply these psychoanalytic principles and that experience to different structures, to different social structures, to the family. Um, and I'm working with other people in an organization called Spiral. It's the Society for Psychoanalytic and Interdisciplinary Interventions and Research after
Oh.
Lacan. It's a mouthful, but we are working on these kinds of metapsychological issues and how to apply them to sociocultural and political context, to the clinical work with the family, to a clinic of psychosis, if you will. Um, so to writing, and so it's an ongoing work that's come out of that. So.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you
awesome.
for allowing me an opportunity to speak about this to your
Yeah,
audience.
of course. I two things that came up. One, I'm gonna get this quote wrong, but I think Carl Jung said something about the first half of life is in preparation for the second half of life. And
Hmm.
kind of like kind of like what you were saying, the first half of life, you're kind of external focused. How much can I take control of the external world and order it in the way that I want? And then the second half of life, you kind of it kind of in the reverse is true to where that's you kind of start to go in more as you start to lose strength or your looks or whatever it might be.
Hmm.
That was just something that popped in my head. And two, yeah, I hope you didn't take offense to in the beginning I introduced you as a student of psychoanalysis. I was thinking yesterday actually, um, in the APA, one of the values is to be a lifelong learner. And I
Hmm.
was thinking to myself, you know, I don't think lifelong learner hits the nail on the head. I think what we shouldn't just be lifelong learners, we should be lifelong students. And so,
Yeah.
yes, exactly how you said, like, yeah, uh, even though you've been in the game for a while and you're part of the school and you're doing all this research, I think being a student of psychoanalysis is a high,
Yes.
yeah,
It's a high bar. Yes. I
yeah.
think that was a good way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Uh,
thanks for having me here.
yeah, thanks, Mihaela, for joining me. I really appreciate the conversation and the the new resources and references. I want to check out that podcast and look into some of these people you've mentioned. And yeah, if you can you send me the a few names you mentioned throughout our time?
Yes, I will send you an email. We can follow up by email for sure.